Okay, so tonight this seminar is about identity horror, and I've called it The Question in Bodies, which is a title that I came up with because it sounded kind of clever when I came up with it a little while ago. That sounded better in my head. It's late, what can I say? So the term identity horror was something that I came up with myself a few years ago. I'm fairly certain I was not the first to come up with the term identity horror. I'm not precious about it. I don't think I've got a copyright on it. But this evening, what I want to do is state a case for identity horror as being a discrete genre, and to lay out the principles of what that genre might contain, and why I think it matters, and why I think that it's a useful category to have in the present day. So I'm going to talk about this in the sense of sections, subcategories. I've sort of broken it down a bit. So the first thing I want to ask is the question, am I okay? And to start with that, I'm going to show you a video that I harvested from YouTube. This is from about 4 years ago.
Do you ever wish you could just restart? Everything's gonna be okay. Don't worry about it, you're gonna be fine. I think everything's gonna be okay. What would it be like if you could just restart? You need to stop worrying so much. What if you could reboot yourself? Almost like a computer. I wonder what it's like to reboot. Everything's gonna be A-okay. Is it okay to think things like this? This planet makes sense to me. Everything's perfect. Am I gonna be okay? The internet makes sense to me. Everything in your life is perfect. What do you have to worry about? It's okay. I think everything's gonna be fine. I believe that everything's okay.
Yeah, everything's not okay. So yeah, that was Poppy, and that's fairly representative of the sort of work that she did a few years ago on YouTube, which used to regularly scare children. I think that that's a great, very short, discrete, contained example of identity horror. You have someone who's presenting a certain kind of dissociation going on there, a sense that the statements, the disjointed statements that everything will be okay are, you know, they're on top of a sort of slightly unsettling soundscape, but they're interspersed with statements that suggest things that aren't okay. And then right at the very end, you see that moment of horror before it cuts out. That's identity horror. But this is the point at which I think you have to define identity horror. And this is how I want to define identity horror. Identity horror is the horror of the human self under threat. Okay, and that's different to the human body under threat, and it is different to human life under threat. This is more elemental. This is about selfhood, about identity, about who you are being in danger. Identity horror admits the trauma of oppression, and that's oppression in a kind of personal level, in abuse, in abusive relationships, abusive homes, abusive upbringings, abusive institutions, but also oppression in the sense of what people on the internet now call intersectionality, the idea that there are lots of different angles in which people who are marginalized are put down. And obviously this has been something that's on people's minds a lot, particularly since it's both Pride Month and the things that are going on in pretty much every major city in the English-speaking world right now, but especially in the USA. Identity horror admits the forcible mutability of human selves. That is, the horror comes from agencies changing people. The horror comes from an outside force making you different in mind and body and altering who you are. And there's several ways it does that, but identity horror admits the invasion of the human self by technology. The idea that the culture we live in, the technological culture we live in, might actually make us different people. But it also admits the invasion of the human selves by nature, by the world, by the environment, by forces that are older than us and outside of our things. But the fundamental underlying thing that governs these things and makes identity horror is this simple statement: we are not okay. This is close to my heart. This is something that I've been thinking about for about 4 years now. It's something I've been writing about on and off for 3 or 4 years, and will eventually become one of my books. But the idea, really, for me, is important because I have spent a large part of my life struggling with my identity, and recently this has been particularly keen for me since a few months ago I sought a psychological assessment, a diagnosis in fact for adult ADHD, because I wanted to know, am I weird and incompetent, or is this actually a neurological disorder? And it turns out it's a neurological disorder. But during that diagnosis, to my shock and surprise, I was also diagnosed as autistic, which is something that I never really even considered. And this was kind of crushing, partly because, I've spent much more than half of my life actively suppressing my personality characteristics, parts of me that are, make functioning in society difficult. And I've operate according to a set of complex and exhausting rules in everyday conversation, which I didn't actually even realize that most people don't seem to have. And the most frightening thing for me, and the horror of it, was that I don't actually really have a strong handle on who I am right now. And I process these things through watching horror movies, because they're cathartic and they're useful, and they help you to process and work through these. All these they do for me. And so that's my background. That's where I'm coming from. Now, let's have a look at some horror movies. Let's have a look at some texts and see if we can tease out some of those things that come from identity horror. So first is the fact that you often find stories that don't necessarily operate in a linear fashion. In many identity horror texts, you have stories where people might actually, in the shape of the story, be someone else, be someone different than the people that they are at the beginning of the story. That this is more than simply being an unreliable narrator. It might be part of that, but the simple world presented by the story, because it is just a story, is mutable. And because it's mutable, the identities of the people in it can change. And the earliest example of that non-linear selfhood that you see in these stories comes in the 1920 film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is an amazing piece of work. You have a framing sequence where a young man called Francis explains something very strange and disturbing that happens to him and to his fiancée, and he explains this to an older man who he's talking to. And he tells the story of a fair where a sinister showman who goes by the name of Dr. Caligari uses a sleepwalking man to commit acts of murder. And the sleepwalking man, Cesar, who's played by Conrad Veidt, best known, I think, now for playing the Nazi captain in Casablanca. He's sent out to murder people. And okay, that's spooky enough. But then you have the fact that the environment in which the flashback story is presented is kind of wonky. Everything seems to be cartoonish. It's all painted backdrops, and obviously painted backdrops, and there are no right angles. Things are wonky and straight. Look at the frames of the windows in this scene. Look at the way in which the shadows are actually literally painted on the floor. The entire world is off kilter and strange. The Dr. Caligari is not Dr. Caligari. It turns out that he is the doctor in charge of the insane asylum, and who himself goes mad and becomes Dr. Caligari, the real Dr. Caligari, having been someone 150 years before who used the sleepwalking man to commit murder. Except that may not be the case as well. Francis ends the film in the insane asylum as an inmate, as does his fiancée Jane, as does Cesar, who is clearly not sleepwalking and who actually died in the action of the flashback. There are contradictions. It becomes difficult. Or is it? Or is there another reason why Jane and Francis have been admitted to the asylum? Did they have a psychological break because of what happened to them? Is Dr. Caligari really the mad doctor or a benevolent physician? Is it the end, or is it? It's the first example in horror movies of the "or was it" ending, which is, the hand comes out of the grave, or the monster isn't dead, that sort of thing. This sort of happens at the end of Dr. Caligari when he puts the glasses on, and you think, oh, is he really the mad doctor after all? It's a tremendous piece of work. It's hugely unsettling, and it's really slippery in the sense of the identities of its protagonists and antagonists as well. Another more recent example, but still pretty old actually now, is David Lynch's debut feature, Eraserhead. In this film, Jack Nance's character has to deal with a monstrous baby. He's got deformed, tiny people singing and dancing behind his radiator, and all sorts of other strange things that happen, which all seem, are they in his head? Are they not in his head? It doesn't matter if they're in his head or not, because it's a movie. But the narrative is fractured, and because the narrative is fractured, he is fractured, and in the end, he's just rubbed out by a giant eraser. There's something very strange and dreamlike about it. It operates by dream logic, but dream logic admits changes themselves. We've all had dreams where we don't know who we are, or we become someone different, or the people we know may have different faces and different shapes, but still have the same names. These are the characteristics of dreams. But these are also traumatic as well. So the pun here is not träum is German for dream. So Träume and trauma. You see what I did there? I thought it was clever when I wrote it. Trauma is sort of a central part of identity horror. In Andrzej Żuławski's 1996 film Jamanko, which is not strictly a horror film, though it admits horrific aspects, you have the story of a nameless Polish girl called Wloszka, or the Italian, because she used to work in a pizza parlor, who, due to a lifetime of abuse and marginalization, she has the characteristics of being autistic. She has the characteristics of being hugely traumatized. And Ivona Petri, in her only real screen performance, gives every impression of someone who is facing trauma. She enters a torrid love affair with a lecturer at the university, an anthropologist, who becomes obsessed with her because he's found a bog mummy in a peat bog underneath some building work, and he's examining this bog mummy, and he becomes obsessed with shamanism, and at one point drops 3,000-year-old mushrooms, which is not a good idea. And she, meanwhile, cannot help who she is, but at the same time, while having on paper all of the characteristics of the dreaded manic pixie dream girl, she's actually tragic and frightening and rapacious. She's got this need for sex. There's a lot of banging in this film, of all kinds, but it never feels pornographic. It just feels awkward and sweaty and limb tangly, and this sometimes wrong. There's a scene where she gets off against the cabinet full of archaeological objects in a museum. It's never quite right. And the film was written by a feminist theorist, but on the other hand, one of the reasons Ivona Petri never acted again was because she claimed that she'd been horrifically abused on set by Żuławski. In which case you find yourself thinking, is the trauma that she's expressing on her face real? Is she really hating every second of this and longing to be free because she's being bullied into this just stunning performance? It's hard to tell. It's a difficult film to watch, and it's a difficult film to think about, but it's definitely identity horror. Another film with a difficult woman who might be on the autistic spectrum and who suffers socially is Lucky McKee's debut feature, May, from 2002. May is a girl who she's got a lazy eye, she suffers bullying, she's bullied, she grows up awkward and shy and with odd circumstances. She works in a vet's, she's got a thing for dead animals. She is told by her mother as a child, if you can't find a friend, make one. After having her friendship and her affections exploited and abused by a succession of shallow hipsters, among them Anna Faris, May decides that she's not going to find a friend, and therefore she's got to literally make one. Which is why Anna Faris faces her fate in this scene. So yeah, it's a difficult film, but again, it's very much identity horror. It's very much about someone who really doesn't know who she is and who transforms halfway through from someone shy and weird and on, somewhere on that autistic spectrum they talk about, into something terrifying. And at the end, it's like Frankenstein from the mad scientist's viewpoint. In the Soska Sisters 2012 film American Mary, Mary plays a Catherine Isabel, who's better known for playing the teenage werewolf in the film Ginger Snaps, plays a med student called Mary who because she takes up some work as a stripper, finds herself tapped to do some emergency surgery for some organized crime guys, and then finds herself tapped by people to do some elective surgery for people who want extreme body mods that ethical surgeons won't do. Her teachers in the med school see that she's at the nightclub a lot. They see that she's suddenly got a lot of money. They put 2 and 2 together and make 17 and think that she's now doing sex work. So they get her to a party, drug her and gang rape her, these medical teachers. She gets one of them. She quits med school. She decides to go into extreme body modification as a career, and she finds her cheap rapist, gets some of her mobster friends to take him home, and she keeps him in her basement and practices on him. So it's kind of a rape revenge film as well, and the rape revenge genre is not really something I feel qualified to talk about a great deal, but this is probably, I think it's one of the better rape revenge films. I've been told this by people who really like the genre. It's a really quite powerful film. There are consequences to everything that happens. But it's also about the way in which people need to see themselves in their bodies. It's a film about dysphoria, and that dysphoria is reflected a little in how Mary responds to this and how she throws herself into this body modification lark. You have some extreme stuff. There's a sequence with a pair of twins who are also incestuous, and they ask her if she would swap their left arms so they'll always be connected. And if one dies, then the other one lives in her. Yeah, it's a difficult film. The Soska sisters have blotted their copybooks recently by proving themselves to be kind of outright, but fortunately this doesn't come up in this film. It doesn't appear to be in the film, although having thought of it, everyone in the film is white, so I don't know. Darren Aronofsky, when he made Mother, and this is my theory, and I think this is entirely conjecture, but I think he's got legs on it. He got himself a notebook and he wrote down a list of everything that I would find most distressing, uncomfortable, and anxiety-inducing in a movie, and then proceeded to include it all. I have never seen such an anxiety-inducing movie. I've never seen such a film so calculated to make me go. Jennifer Lawrence plays a woman. She lives in a big house with a poet with writer's block, who's played by Javier Bardem. To be honest, no matter how surreal the film gets, nothing is more surreal than the idea that a poet with writer's block could afford a big house like that. But, you know, or even any poet could afford a house like that. But having said that, what happens is the house gets successively invaded by more and more people, and by the end of the film is in fact mayhem. You get riots, you get violence, you get the police turning up with riot shields and kettling people, you get fire and explosions and death and murder and brutality all around her. And presumably she's supposed to be a metaphor for the world, but that's okay. That it's also about human disintegration, about how our safe spaces, when they are invaded, can damage us and destroy us. And there's no safety in the film. There's no trust in the film, and that makes it hugely difficult to watch. Another way in which identity horror manifests itself, and particularly apocalyptic identity horror manifests itself, is in the idea of the doppelganger, the double. In folklore and traditionally, the appearance of the doppelganger heralds destruction. You meet your double, something dies, someone dies, no one gets out alive. And you know, there are many great identity horror films that see this. So Robert Altman's film Images stars Susanna York as Catherine, who may or may not be a writer of children's books, who lives with a slightly older husband, Rene Auberjonois, who's best known now for playing the guy with the putty face in Deep Space Nine. But so I didn't recognize him to begin with, because obviously he had an actual face rather than face made of putty, but who knows. Catherine is beset by various ghosts. She's beset by the ghosts of the ghost of a dead former lover, visions of a friend of her husband who may or may not also be a former lover, who may or may not be trying to get into her pants again. Vivid visions of these things happening. Images, in fact, she meets a young girl who's called Susanna, and incidentally played by someone called Catherine. So you have, and Susanna looks exactly like she did as a child, and so you've got a Susanna played by a Catherine, who is acting as a sort of younger version of a Catherine played by a Susanna. Eventually, she also sees her doppelganger mocking her, approaching, and no matter what she does, she can't make it go away. The film ends in disintegration and murder, and we're never quite sure to what extent this is real. And of course, obviously, the answer is none of it is, because it's a film, but then that's what makes it so unsettling, because films are supposed to show us a form of something that's real, and it doesn't. It just goes off the rails. Another film that goes off the rails and is even more unsettling is Francesco Barilli's unbelievably strange 1974 film, The Perfume of the Lady in Black. It stars Mimsy Farmer, who is, in the 1970s, was known for losing her shit in movies, and who, at some point in the 80s, transitioned out of acting and into production design, and wound up winning awards relatively recently for being the set designer of Guardians of the Galaxy. But in this thing, she plays a woman who is a professional and who begins to be beset by visions of an abusive rapist stepfather, of her neglectful mother, of the loss of her father. And eventually her home is barged into by a little girl who we realize is actually literally her inner child, her doppelganger as a little girl. She regresses into a sort of weird childlike state, and murder ensues. Or does it? We don't know. The final sequence of the film dispenses with all narrative logic whatsoever, and we see all of the characters in the film, everybody in the world, living and dead, as conspirators in a sort of cult or big plan to destroy her, in the way that the world conspires against women so often to bring them to nothing. It's an Italian film from 1974. That means that it's not going to be a landmark moment in the positive representation of women in film. But while it has a number of misogynistic and in fact also racist tropes, these don't seem to be personal ones. They're structural. They're tropes that are common to films of the era, but at the same time you can see that the director is moving towards understanding. He's moving towards trying to present the way in which the world's conspires against humans in general, but women in particular. And it has, I think, to be honest, I think it has a lot more to say than, and is actually a lot less misogynist than many supposedly explicitly feminist films made today. I think existing before a lot of the language of third wave feminism and of intersectionality, it doesn't have that language, and therefore is able to not be constrained by it and not tick off the list. Anyway, the big monster of doppelganger movies is possession. You have Isabelle Adjani playing Anna, who is a sort of modern doppelganger, Anna Karenina, and she is cheating on her secret agent husband. Her husband is called Mark. He's played by Sam Neill. Their marriage falls apart. It falls apart spectacularly and violently. And at some point, she goes absolutely batshit insane in the Berlin subway and gives birth to a tentacled monstrosity that eventually grows into a size big enough for her to have sex with and have an affair with by keeping in a shabby flat at the East End of Berlin and near the wall, and which then turns into a doppelganger of her husband, who himself is having an affair with a doppelganger of Anna, who's also played by Isabelle Adjani, only with different coloured eyes and hair. It's a painful film to watch. I think the most difficult scenes are the marriage breakup scenes rather than the violence and the losing your shit in the subway scenes and things like that. I think it's Zawadzki. Again, it's basically a horror film based upon his own marriage breakup. I think you only need to listen to the commentaries to realize that Zawadzki was basically a gaping arsehole. But the point is still that he's a gaping arsehole who nonetheless has a fairly accurate and clear-eyed view of human nature and can represent it while still not being that good and that good a person. And so you have Mark, who is Zawadzki's insect character, who is nonetheless a jerk and presented as a jerk, as a terrible person. And as a result of that, you see something real happening. And the film is full of trauma, full of pain and trauma. Over in the USA, you had the ridiculously awkward art film Liquid Sky. One of the central tropes of it is Anne Carlisle, who plays the androgynous model Margaret, and who also plays the androgynous model Jimmy. And their nemesis, Margaret is basically used by people for drugs and sex all the time. She's got no self-esteem. She is beset by aliens who are after A, heroin, and B, orgasms, because they eat people who orgasm in their vicinity, and because she's very good at giving orgasm but never actually has one. She's a prime example as a vehicle for the aliens feeding. That imputes more sense to the film than in fact has. But again, it has another fractured narrative. Everybody's kind of affectless and jaded, and it's not really sure if they're actually just being affectless and jaded or if they're actually just crappy actors. It's an oddly effective film with a really, really strange soundtrack. It's either got one of the greatest or one of the worst soundtracks in the history of cinema, and it's very difficult to tell. It presents a world, though, which is capitalist, and where everyone commodifies everyone. And commodification is also a part of identity horror. In 2009, Joss Whedon made the short-lived TV series Dollhouse, which starred Eliza Dushku as Echo, and Echo was one of a stable of beautiful young people who'd had their minds wiped and who could be installed with temporary personalities and then rented out to rich people to fulfill whatever needs they may have had. That was exactly as skeevy as you might imagine. The TV series tries to make lots of salient points about exploitation, sexual and otherwise, of people. It tries to make points about the commodification of the human mind and of the human spirit. And it wants to be about those things, and it really wants to be about those things. But what it is, in fact, actually about is Eliza Dushku's bottom, and also Eliza Dushku's cleavage, cheekbones, and eyelashes, but mainly her bottom. And this is fundamentally the most frustrating thing about it. It wants to approach the idea of capitalism as psychic and physical rape, but it's too busy going, isn't she lovely? Let's just ogle her a bit. And that crushes it. And I mean, there's a reason it only went to two. I'm surprised it even went to 2 seasons. It's, you know, anybody who, you know, even thought that Joss Whedon might have had problems, I don't see why they missed it with the existence of Dollhouse. But still, it's a piece of identity horror. It's a piece of ham-fisted, badly done identity horror. Now, it would have been great if Dollhouse, you know, that idea about the commodification of the human spirit was actually done properly and given space to breathe and presented, made, you know, acted better and presented by people who knew what they were doing. Oh, wait, it was, because Orphan Black exists. And Orphan Black begins as the story of Sarah Manning, and that's her on the left, and she's played by Titania Maslany, who discovers a woman. She watches a woman who looks exactly like her commit suicide and steals the woman's identity before discovering that she and the woman who just committed suicide were in fact clones, and that there's several other clones. So we see actually one of the other clones is the supremely damaged and slightly psychopathic Helena, played by Titania Maslany, as they all are. You have Titania Maslany sometimes in 5 different roles in the same scene. Which is done with incredible amounts of digital trickery and body doubles and all sorts of stuff. Acting masterclass. The ironic thing is that the least effective character in the show is Sarah Manning, because Titania Maslany can't really do a British accent that well, but shorts and stuff like that. But yeah, but the show is still amazing, and you have these really, really impressive concepts over and over again over the whole 5 seasons before it comes to a graceful end. And the one that really sticks out to me is when Cosima, who's the clone who's educated as a scientist, there's one who grew up in Russia and is trained as an assassin, there's one who grew up as a middle-class soccer mum, there's one who's a police officer, there's one who's trans, Cosima is gay. It's interesting to see how nurture and nature mix, and the show explores that in the sense of identity. Cosima discovers that she can actually work out her own DNA sequence. And so she resequences her own DNA, you know, works out the sequence of her DNA and finds in her DNA a copyright notice, which is crushing and amazing. The commodification of race as well and of poverty happens in Boots Riley's amazing movie, Sorry to Bother You. You have Lakeith Stanfield, who plays the wonderfully named Cassius Green, except if you're American, it's Cassius Green. So his cash is green. You see, because cash is, yeah, because he's always on the thing for the money. He's always on the hustle because he's poor and he has to. He gets a job as a telemarketer, and he discovers that if he adopts a white-sounding voice, he becomes really good at it. Which means that, you know, you get these hilarious scenes where he opens his mouth and you get the voice of David Cross coming out, and David Cross of Arrested Development, and several other things, Alvin and the Chipmunks as well, because my kids know him from that. And yeah, so he gets this job as a telemarketer. He learns that with his white voice he can sell anything to anyone, and he gets promoted dizzyingly to a point where he is selling slave labor. And more importantly, he's selling genetically modified slave labor. He stumbles across a plan to turn people into sort of a half human slave species. And of course, that's the thing about transhumanism, that thought that actually they could make the rich people better, but they could also make the poor people subhuman. And once you make rich people and poor people different species, that's the end of social mobility, and that is horror. And a lot of that you see on the internet. I'm going to move away from that for a second, and I'm going to talk about one of the rules of the internet. Particularly, I want to talk about Rule 34. I don't actually know if rules 1 to 33 exist, but Rule 34 is a rule that is spoken of on the internet. You may know Rule 34 is simply this: if something exists, there is internet porn of it. Anyone who's browsed the fan art site DeviantArt and looked for Scooby-Doo fan art will know that this is true. Or Kim Possible fan art, or Elsa from Frozen fan art. I did a thought experiment, and I thought, come on, I'm going to go to DeviantArt. I'm going to see if I put in Elsa from Frozen adult, see if I can. I found it, and now I can't unsee it. A film that expresses both the commodification of humanity in the light of Rule 34 is the film Demon Lover. And Demon Lover, made in 2002 by Olivier Assayas. The quality of this image, by the way, is deliberate, because this is an image which is on someone's computer monitor of the protagonist, played by the supremely underrated Connie Nielsen, an actor who can play 8 languages and fluently speaks 3 of them in the course of this movie. Yeah, she plays a woman who's in industrial espionage, who comes across a website, a company called Demon Lover, who essentially make extreme porn and torture the women on the screen for the sake of the credit cards of horny teenagers. And they torture them on screen for realsies. And she stumbles further into this, and then you realize that not only is she going to wind up being one of the women tortured, she may actually have been that woman all along. And again, you have this shifting identity. And part of it made me think that essentially the entire moral of the film comes to the Rule 34 corollary. That is Rule 34A, which I came up with and was very pleased with myself, and then I was very not pleased with myself. Because obviously, okay, Rule 34, if something exists, there is porn of it on the internet. Rule 34A, the corollary to Rule 34 is this: therefore, if you exist on the internet, look, we're all adults here, you worked it out. But this actually only really works if, it only really works if you actually have some sort of following. Now, the musician Momus said famously In the future, everyone's going to be famous for 15 people, so it's easier to have nano celebrity. An art project that I did for several years before essentially destroying it for various reasons due to traumatic stuff that happened. But I did an art project. I had an alter ego who was internet famous for a bit, and the images and art I made wound up in people's porn repositories. So in a sense, Rule 34A may not be true of you, but it's true of me. And that's worrying. I think if you've got celebrity, particularly, you know, if you're, I know that there's at least 2 or 3 people who are listening now who are writers, and, you know, if you're a woman who writes, you know, this is a problem, right? But anyway, it's celebrity as a thing, and celebrity as part of identity horror appears quite a bit. The idea that a celebrity might be transformed, and I don't mean in the classic melodrama way of a celebrity, you know, failing to recognize the old people from the homestead. I mean in the sense that celebrity might actually turn someone into somebody other than human, or into something terrible, into something strange. You have Black Swan, Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan. When I saw this in the cinema, I walked out of the cinema at the end of it, and I said to the friend I was with, well, there's another one of the grand tradition of movies about women losing their minds made by straight white men. And yeah, it is. It's a film about a woman losing her mind made by a straight white man. Natalie Portman. It's a ballerina. You see the crunching pain of ballet, which is apparently nothing like real ballet, but which eventually turns into bodily transformations which she may or may not be experiencing. There is a doppelganger who's not really a doppelganger because it's someone else. So she's got an alter ego who may or may not exist, played by Mila Kunis. It's not as great a film as all that, but it's still better than The Neon Demon, which Nicholas Winding Refn made in 2016, possibly 2017. I might got that wrong. Elle Fanning plays a young woman who goes to Los Angeles and whose purity of appearance and whose blank canvas of a body makes her in demand as a model. She gets into modeling, into fashion. Something about the modeling industry begins to remove her identity, and she becomes a blank canvas. She becomes empty inside and out. And when it is too late, the industry eats her. There is a sense, and I was thinking about this particularly actually when you look at 1970s Italian movies, which I've watched a lot of in the last few months. There's a sense that sometimes you have filmmakers who are trying to show things like misogyny and racism, and they wind up doing it. And The Neon Demon is a film that is clearly about misogyny, and it's about the way that women are destroyed and objectified and used, but does so by chopping up women and objectifying them in a really uncomfortable way. And it's a beautiful and glossy looking film, glossy and beautiful like a fashion spread, but it's unpleasant in ways that I don't really think it should be. That, you know, there's a good sort of, I mean, talking about horror movies, right? Horror movies, there's good unpleasant and there's bad unpleasant. This is bad unpleasant. I hate it. I really, really despised this film. I didn't despise Starry Eyes. Starry Eyes had Starry Eyes been made 3 or 4 years later, it would have been hailed as the Me Too Hollywood movie. You have a young woman who goes to Hollywood and she wants to be an actor, and she goes through all sorts of terrible audition experiences, which I have been told by a friend who's an actor in London, are things that she herself has either experienced or seen happen. You have the terrible situation where, in order to get a spot on the casting couch, she's got to give someone a blowjob. You have this moves on in that she essentially, these figures who are abusive of women in the industry are in the film literally evil and literally part of a terrible occult conspiracy, which, in order to succeed, she has to give herself to. She becomes transformed into a being of doll-like beauty, albeit with no hair. I mean, you can see it's obviously a bald cap, but you can see where her ponytail is bunched up at the base of her skull there. But at the same time, she's got claws and fangs and stars in her eyes, and she herself becomes a cannibalistic horror in order to be successful. And she carves up all of her friends to do so. It would be the Me Too horror movie had it been made a few years later. I think it's hugely underrated. I think it's an excellent indie horror. And of course, final point about commodification and the internet and media. Again, we've got Poppy. I showed you a Poppy video at the start. There are about 380 in that mode before she moved on to other things. I mean, she's still making videos, but now she's making wholesome makeup videos, albeit slightly creepy wholesome makeup videos. And there's lots of reasons as to why that might have happened. But when she was doing this sort of thing, you had this big body of identity horror. I did actually manage to, I marathoned all 357 of those videos, and let me tell you, I don't want to ever do that again, even though I actually kind of adore Poppy. I love Poppy, I think she's great, but the sense of identity horror, the sense of the internet, she has an episode where she simply says, I'm in trouble. I've done something that will offend them, and they want me to stand up and change, and they want me to apologize, and things like that. You have this, and it's blackly comedic, but it presents a world where you have an individual who has been destroyed by the internet and turned into a sort of doll. She's mediated. She's digital. She exists in television. She's new flesh. Now, the new flesh is an idea that came with David Cronenberg, and I could probably talk about all of David Cronenberg's films made between 1970 and 1999. But there's an entire 30-year period where he basically just does identity horror. But I just want to talk about a few of them. I want to talk about Shivers, the nasty 1975 film where a scientist accidentally makes a parasite, which is like a kind of, it's like halfway between a slug, except it looks like a penis. And these things crawl into people's orifices, all the orifices, and eventually transform people into kind of sex zombies. They become rapacious and pansexual and horny as hell. And of course, when you do it with them, you become a sex zombie. And you love being a sex zombie and you think it's brilliant and you want to leave the tower block and go and infect the whole world. And what's chilling about this movie is how much these people love being sexy zombies when they're infested. And it infests some kids, and that's hugely uncomfortable and nasty, and yeah, it's just horrible. Better known is, of course, Videodrome. James Woods plays a television executive who discovers a television show that is is a television show that kills people on screen. It tortures people to death on screen, but also through watching it, it alters your body and it alters your mind. You become a different human being. It is viral, and you know, this is a good 25 years before viral became a thing on the internet. Here's Barry Convex thrusting a Betamax video cassette into the vaginal opening that Videodrome has made open in James Woods' stomach in order to program him as an assassin to destroy Bianca O'Blivion, the daughter of the television theorist Brian O'Blivion, who's really Marshall McLuhan by another name. And Brian O'Blivion only exists now in a cathode ray tube, which is the fate also of James Woods' hookup at the beginning of the film, is played by Deborah Harry, who also winds up becoming a creature of cathode ray pixels. Brian O'Blivion talks at one point about only having a television name, about how, you know, when he's mediated by the media, he has a false name. Anyone who's been on Twitter or on an internet forum knows about that. It's a weirdly prophetic film. Another weirdly prophetic film that Cronenberg made is Existenz, which is the virtual reality film of the late 90s, which has aged better than any of the others. And that, yes, that includes The Matrix, all right. Existenz has Jennifer Jason Leigh as a video game designer who goes on the run with Jude Law, a sort of hapless guy. The video game works by having a kind of weird anal sphincter implanted in your spine, which is then penetrated by the fleshly, living, organic games console's plug, which gently screws you as you lie in a virtual reality trance. There's something polymorphously perverse about this. There's something about it that makes you shudder, that makes you sort of wonder about it. But at the same time, there's something kind of liberating about the queerness of this film. It is defiantly, powerfully queer, but also organic. And actually, the organic technology in the film means that it hasn't dated, because it was always fantastical, and it doesn't look any less fantastical or any more fantastical than it did. But the virtual reality ideas, and the idea that you might actually have an entirely different identity in the virtual realm, and you might literally become a different person through the virtual realm, are things that are very salient now. And it involves gender. I mean, you know, what happens when you have an extra sexual orifice put in you? You become transhuman, but you also, you know, you transcend gender, transhuman, transgender, trans everything. And the idea of the evolution of the human race, the transhuman, is something that also comes up in identity horror. In Saul Bass's hugely underrated film Phase 4, the ants become intelligent. super intelligent. And for much of the film, it's a battle between a couple of scientists and a colony of ants. At the end of the film, we discover that, in fact, the ants don't want to destroy us. They want to colonize us. They want to assimilate us into the hive mind. And in the original form, which is the form of the ending, which has recently been re-released in DVD, they succeed. The human race enters a kind of apocalypse where the humans become hive mind creatures like the ants. Another film where nature parasitizes people is in the film Upstream Color. And Upstream Color is one of my favorite films of all time. I love this movie. You have Amy Simons and Shane Carruth, who also wrote, directed, and composed the music, as a couple of people, both of whom have been parasitized by a worm that removes your will and wipes your memory, with their memories altered by an unscrupulous man who uses the worm to clean out their bank accounts. They both think that they've done terrible things, which of course, in fact, they're innocent of. They're drawn together in one of the most tragic scenes. The male protagonist, Jeff, says to Chris, the female protagonist, when he's describing his work colleagues who think that he's embezzled money. In fact, it was stolen, but he got, took responsibility for embezzling it because of an addiction that he never had. They talk to me in a certain way. They look at me in a certain way, a way that you don't look at me yet. And that yet is so heartrending, that idea that everyone might feel that way. And it's a thing that, personally speaking, I have struggled with my entire life. The idea that people might turn and people might not see me the way that they have, because, and part of that is my issue with my subsumed identity. It's a troubling film. It's a powerful film. It eventually has the two of them piecing things together. There are books as well which present the idea of the environment making a person transhuman. You have Gwendolyn Christ's Bram Stoker award-winning novel, The Rust Maidens, which has a group of young women in Cleveland, Ohio, who take upon themselves the form of industrial decay, of rust and broken asphalt and smoke. Eventually, they transcend and become part of the environment themselves. Spoilers, sorry. The main character, however, is excluded from this. She's a teenage girl called Phoebe who, and then in another part of the book, she's an adult called Phoebe, looking back on her teenage years, who has, as a teenager, gained one of those nebulous bad reputations that young women sometimes get, which means that they can't be part of their communities without ever really having done anything wrong. And Phoebe is protected from having become one of the Rust Maidens of the title because of that, because she is excluded, because she's an exile. She finds healing in exile, but at the same time, there's a sense of longing there, a sense that the Rust Maidens belong wholly to their community, to their city. There's a certain beauty to the horror of their bodies becoming rusted girders and smoke and dust. Horror and decay also appears in Georges Franju's 1960 film Eyes Without a Face. Although made in 1960, it's a French classic, and that means that there are moments in this movie where you watch it and you have to watch it through your fingers, because there are some terrifyingly good practical effects. It concerns a mad scientist, well, a scientist who's a great cosmetic surgeon whose daughter has a car accident and whose face becomes irretrievably scarred. He arranges for the kidnap of young women whose faces he steals and grafts onto his daughter's face. But it doesn't work. In the words of a singer-songwriter who we don't like much anymore, does the body rule the mind or the mind rule the body? I don't know. Her mind, her identity rejects these faces, and it's only through becoming something else, something other than entirely human, that she can actually break this cycle. While becoming also the agent of vengeance against her father, who is torturing her and mutilating and driving to suicide innocent young women. Many scenes in Eyes Without a Face appear in Pedro Almodovar's 2011 and very troubling film, The Skin I Live In. In this film, you have Antonio Banderas playing a frankly psychopathic genius surgeon who has a woman in his attic who he is grafting skin onto. We will discover later that the woman is in fact a man who he blames for the death of his daughter, he blames for the rape and death of his daughter. The man's not a great guy, but he certainly doesn't deserve to undergo a forced vaginoplasty. The central conceit of the film, people cannot agree as to whether it's transphobic or not, but the thing that I find especially striking as someone whose own gender identity is best described as wobbly is powerful, because you have essentially a cisgender person who is forced to understand what it is like to be trans at the end of the film, although in the body of a beautiful woman in a pretty dress. He returns to his family and he asserts vocally that he is a he with a man's name. Another book that's worth looking at is Carmen Maria Machado's short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties, from a couple of years ago. Again, these are stories about human transformations, and they're about particularly the experience of women being, invaded and oppressed by the environment, by the world in which they're in, and that environment is both social and natural as well. It's a very powerful collection of stories. The second story in the book is about it starts out as essentially one of those pieces where a woman gives an inventory of everyone she's ever slept with, only you realize about 3 entries in that it's also the story of a worldwide pandemic that's wiping out the human race, and I really didn't need to read that this week. Of course, the oppression of women, we talked about trans stuff, and of course the other big axis of oppression is the oppression of people of color, Black people. And I am obviously not as qualified to talk about this, so I'm just going to very briefly mention Jordan Peele's movies. I'm going to mention Get Out, which is like a sort of Stepford Wives thing. You have a conspiracy of rich white liberals who want nothing more than to appropriate Black identities by kidnapping Black people and stealing their bodies, Stepford Wives style, and putting themselves in with a thing between mysticism and science. That's contrasted with, that's the wrong way, with Jordan Peele's second movie, Us. And Us, I think, is exquisite. Us is fantastic. It draws on a tradition of urban myth, which I talked about the other week when I approached this film. But it also deals with the idea of the doppelganger as a destructive force. It deals with a black middle class family and a white middle class family, and the fact that the black middle class family still exists precariously. There's a scene where the son goes off on the beach, and you realize the mother, Lupita Nyong'o, is terrified because she's scared he might see a policeman. You see the white family are not equipped to deal with the advent of murderous doppelgangers, while the black family absolutely are. And I mean, there's a reason for that. And the film eventually has a kind of apocalypse where the entire world meets its doppelganger and the destruction that imposes. But it also asks the question, who's the doppelganger really? Whose identity is whose? Who is human? What is human? So that's a survey of identity horror. And just to reiterate, identity horror is the horror of the human self under threat. It admits the trauma of oppression, and that's personal oppression, relational oppression, but it's also social and structural oppression. It admits the forcible mutability of human selves, and that means body, mind, and spirit. It admits the invasion of human selves by technology. And it admits the invasion of human selves by nature. To close off, I'm just going to show another image from one of Poppy's videos, and this reminded me a bit of Starry Light of Eyes. This is one of her music videos, but this is like possibly one of the last of, I think it's the last creepy video she did. And before that, she's actually moved to something which, well, it's still a bit creepy, but it's sort of edgy and punk rock rather than sort of horror based. And it's almost like she's reset herself here. She appears in a bald cap, and she's got her sexual characteristics covered up, but she's also got claws on her fingers, much like the girl in Starry Eyes. And it's a sense of resetting, a sense of beginning again, a sense of reassuming her identity by becoming nothing, by becoming a blank slate. And I think that's a good place to stop.